Hello, welcome to the City Club of Eugene September 17th, 2021 program. The next normal, flexible, adaptable, visible, the future of working from home. I'm Kitty Piercy, the City Club president. Support for the City Club is provided by our members and sponsors, and we invite you to become a member of City Club. Our programs are always available to you on our YouTube channel and Facebook page. We also have a podcast, which is available on Podbean, and programs are broadcast on public radio station KLCC 89.7 on Monday nights at 7. We have both business and in-kind sponsors, including our diamond sponsors, Kaiser, U of O, Peace Health, and Lane Community College, as well as the generous support from the City of Eugene and from Lane County. In today's program, we welcome Francis Hollis of the London Metropolitan University and Howard Davis from our own University of Oregon. Biographical information on our speakers is available on our website, cityclubofeugene.org. And thanks to Karin Knudsen for coordinating today's program. The next normal, flexible, adaptable, visible, the future of working from home. The abrupt closure of office workplaces was a visible and dramatic response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, millions of people continue to work from home as our unexpected global experiment continues. And recent surveys show that neither the workforce nor company executives want to simply return to pre-pandemic routines. The next normal for work includes expanded flexibility. It has the potential to better support workers, families, and local economies, and to significantly reduce waste, pollution, and stress. The benefits of this change are potentially transformative. The future of work, one that is more flexible, adaptable, and visible, requires the reconsideration of our housing and the participation of our neighbors, and it asks us to rethink how design and policies can better support home-based work. Our speakers today include two international collaborators from the Workforce Project, a research group that studies the tolerance, flexibility, and creativity needed to make future cities and economies more resilient. Architect Francis Hollis from the London Metropolitan University and Professor Howard Davis from the University of Oregon. Our format today includes a question and answer period with City Club members via Zoom.
Good afternoon. I'm Francis Hollis from London Metropolitan University, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak here today. Events that truly alter the course of history are comparatively rare, but it seems that the ongoing pandemic may fall into this category. Watching it unfold, as someone who's been researching the architecture and urbanism of home-based work for 20 years now, has been fascinating. There seems to be widespread agreement that COVID-19 has irreversibly changed the landscape of work. We've known for a long time that most people like working from home, mainly because it increases the control they have over their lives. The really big shift that has happened as a result of this global experiment in enforced home-based work, however, has been in the bosses' perceptions and attitudes. Survey after survey has shown employees to be happier, healthier, less stressed, enjoying spending more time with their families and saving a substantial amount of money on not commuting, eating lunch out, etc., etc. But crucially, these surveys have also shown most people to be equally or more productive than they were when working in a central office. So suddenly, home-based work can be seen to make good business sense, especially in the context of the huge reduction in overheads that is made possible by getting rid of surplus office buildings. This is potentially a win-win situation. While some employers remain desperate to get back to normal, with everyone commuting to work, they're in the minority, and most are shifting to or planning for a hybrid approach that combines working from home with working in collective workplaces. This has profound and radical implications for the way that we inhabit, think about, and design our buildings, neighbourhoods, and cities, because for more than 100 years, homes and workplaces have, strategically and systematically been kept separate at both the architectural and the urban scale. Almost all housing built today is designed around the limited domestic brief of cooking, eating, bathing, sleeping, bringing up children and watching television, nothing more. And it's often regulated to prevent or prohibit homeworking, while our cities are governed by largely monofunctional ordinances. In the context of the COVID-triggered surge in home-based work, this raises major questions, particularly about the future of residential suburbs, high streets, and central business districts. What has just happened with this massive global shock of a pandemic can be interpreted as a paradigm shift. For a century, the built environment has been designed and organised to keep home and work separate, and we now need to find ways to reintegrate them. My research into design for home-based work has two areas of investigation at its heart, the first involving researching precedents. The building type that combines dwelling and workplace has existed for hundreds, if not thousands of years in every culture and every country across the globe, but has previously been little researched or written about. A long and distinguished history can be traced of these dual-use buildings, which I call work homes, from the medieval longhouse, through the weavers' and artists' houses with their tall volumes and big windows, to the briefly popular but ill-fated live-work units of the late 20th century. Many were designed at the scale of the urban block, not just of the individual building, as urban quarters that accommodated blue-collar workspace. Knowledge of this lineage can contribute to an understanding of how to design well for this working practice today. Similarly, historic cities across the world, designed as walking cities before the time of cheap transport, interwove home and workplace to create a fine-grained mixed use. 17th century London is a case in point, where women and men worked side by side in their homes, often living above their shops or workshops, surrounded by their elders and their children. And a jumbled juxtaposition of big and small, smart and tumble-down buildings meant that rich and poor were also close neighbours, providing a model for urban inclusivity in stark contrast to most contemporary urban neighbourhoods. The second aspect of my research has involved investigating contemporary home-based work. Who are these people? What work are they doing? What buildings do they inhabit? And what are their social, spatial, and environmental needs? I've made a close scrutiny of the lives and premises of more than 200 home workers in England, Japan, the Netherlands, and the USA, initially working with 76 urban, suburban, and rural UK home-based workers from across the social spectrum in an unexpectedly wide range of different occupations and living and working in astonishingly different building types. This has resulted in a series of typologies and a set of principles that underlie good design for home-based work. So, how can we transform our buildings and cities to meet the needs of a suddenly enlarged home-based workforce? A central finding of the research is that one size does not fit all. People work from home in a very wide range of jobs, from professionals, such as bankers or architects, through service industries, such as hairdressing or childminding, to the creative industries, including artists and musicians, or craft occupations, such as joinery, furniture making, motor engineering or dressmaking. And they live in radically different households, not just nuclear families. In general, the middle classes accommodate their home-based work through under-occupation in a spare bedroom, an underused dining room, a disused garage, or a shed at the bottom of the garden. People from deprived communities inhabiting public housing, however, disproportionately represented by people of colour, rarely have this option, either because they don't have any spare space or because the sort of work that they do may be prohibited in the home. And the COVID infection and death rates reflect this. An important underlying principle, therefore, when thinking about how to design for home-based work post-COVID is to acknowledge and attempt to mitigate such deeply embedded social and spatial inequalities and injustices. Buildings and cities used to accommodate home-based work across every sector, and they can do again. The research is clear. Good design can maximise the benefits and lessen the undoubted disadvantages of this working practice. 3 guiding principles emerge from 20 years' research into this field. Our buildings and cities need to be designed and governed to maximise their flexibility in use, their adaptability over time, and the visibility of the home-based work being carried on in them. People like to work at home in radically different ways. For example, some like to keep the home and the work aspects of their lives totally separate, while others don't distinguish between the two at all. Some like to work in silent isolation, while others like to be part of a busy, noisy working environment. And our buildings and cities need to start to reflect and accommodate this. There are 4 basic variables: the type of work, the makeup of the household, how much space they have, and the personalities involved. Simple design strategies, such as making functionally neutral facades and volumes, neither obviously domestic nor commercial, and also providing 2 separate entrances to support dedicated work and home realms, especially helpful where the work involves interactions with members of the public, make a difference to how flexibly people can use the spaces they have. And spatial needs change over time. Families and households grow and shrink, and so do businesses. But people don't necessarily want to move every time this happens. Embedding adaptability as an underlying design principle into our buildings and neighbourhoods allows for change of this sort, thereby increasing people's agency over their lives. Houses are generally intrinsically more adaptable than apartments, as side, rear or attic extensions can usually be built with ease. But a creative structural design can contribute to the future adaptability of apartments, allowing inhabitants to reconfigure space to suit their needs, as do ordinances that facilitate the frictionless change of use of a building from residential to commercial and back again, as in Japan. Finally, home-based work needs to become visible in the neighbourhood to reduce social isolation and problems with occupational identity for home workers, to increase the eyes on the street, making neighbourhoods safer, and where a home-based service is offered, whether it's childminding or ironing, accountancy or psychotherapy, joinery, web design or music lessons, to build local social networks and strengthen the local economy. For decades, people have been working in their homes covertly, either because they fear they are or because they actually are breaking some regulation or other. Local, regional and governmental policy has a role here in developing a culture in which this working practice is openly supported and encouraged. Simple strategies like permitting modest signage, including oversized windows onto the street so home workers can see and be seen, and creating collective courtyard or garden spaces that encourage neighbours to get to know each other, bring home-based work into the public realm. As I said before, this is a paradigm shift. This change in how we inhabit our buildings and cities has happened abruptly as a result of the pandemic. It will take time to adjust the way we design and govern them. There is immense scope, however, for the home-based work-driven 24-hour inhabitation of homes and neighbourhoods to bring new life to our buildings, our streets and our local economies. What happens next will largely depend on political will. It remains to be seen what response there will be to this challenge and opportunity. Thank you. Over to you now, Howard, I think.
Okay. I'm Howard Davis. Thank you very much, Francis. And thank you, Karen, for the invitation to speak. I'd like to follow up on Francis's talk by shifting the focus to the United States and to Eugene. In my book, Living Over the Store, I wrote about some of the reasons that zoning ordinances eventually resulted in cities with highly fragmented land uses. While zoning originally served some important functions of keeping noisy and polluting industrial uses away from places where people were living. It also was co-opted to help lock racism into cities, partly through the separation of different housing densities from each other. Just a second here. And it led to the development of land use patterns that have helped exacerbate the use of fossil fuels. It takes a long time to correct such mistakes. For example, it's only now, almost 70 years after President Eisenhower signed into law the construction of the interstate highway system, that the Biden administration is proposing in one of its infrastructure bills the expenditure of money to knit back together some of the urban neighborhoods that were severed with freeway construction. And even if the relevant bill passes both houses of Congress, which is of course not assured, much of the damage is done and irreparable. Now, the pandemic is forcing us to question some basic assumptions about what cities are like. Zoning ordinances, New York's in 1916, Portland's in 1924, Eugene's in 1935, with its first major modification in 1948, were one way of expressing ideals concerning everyday life and lock those ideals into law. These ideals include the idea that the house is for family life. Activities that bring in money for the use of the family happen someplace else for the most part. And furthermore, different parts of the city are associated with different parts of the economic and life cycle: making, selling, consuming, learning, healing. Although variations of these ideals exist, they're often difficult to attain because of our ordinances, because of the structures of development and planning, and because of the societal pressures that maintain these ordinances and structures. Since it's become clear that the pandemic was bringing these ideals into question, there's been much written about which way things are moving, and there's not by any means uniformity of opinion. Some write that most people will go back to the office when the pandemic subsides. Some write that most people will remain working at home. Some see half and half. Some emphasize the movement to suburbs and or smaller cities and towns. Some people emphasize the physical decentralization of large companies, and on and on. In addition to different interpretations of what's happening, there's also conversation about what should happen and why. Being in the same physical space is important to the culture of the office, or Zoom is a great equalizer, or working at home is good for family life, or working at home is bad for family life, or something else. To the extent that we are at a point of inflection, the idea is not to support one or the other point of view, going back to the office or continuing to work at home. As Francis has mentioned, and as our Work Home Project has often stated, one size does not fit all. But saying that is not enough. We need to recognize that the values that have guided and controlled the design of our cities for the last century or so are no longer appropriate for everyone, if they ever were. The major changes in societal structure that are coming to be recognized as critical to mitigating climate change, to countering social inequality and economic injustice, in providing freedom of opportunity, are also implicated in the seemingly simple question of where people work and what is the nature of the home and of the neighborhood. And it's not a matter of either or. Instead, it's a matter of people and businesses having the freedom to do what's most appropriate for their own situations and their own lives. Policies, laws, and development practice, and ultimately the ideals we maintain about the shape of our cities and the built environment in general, need to change from a particular image of the world to ways of living together that's one of respect for people and their and their circumstances, for different ways of working, for different varieties of family life, for different ways of starting a business, for some people who want to go to work and others who want to work at home, for a range of working models that companies might adopt, for an understanding that because of their occupation, many people simply cannot work at home. The city that results from this change of attitudes will be more representative of human and economic variety than our cities are today. It will much better exhibit individual and community control and participation than cities do today, and it will allow life to proceed, giving people and families the opportunity to live and work in ways that are most natural to them. The city of Eugene is in a potentially fortunate position with respect to this question. The current work on increasing housing density, according to HB 2001, the new state law, is a start, but it also represents an opportunity to extend the conversation beyond housing itself to include other ordinary activities of daily life. A neighborhood in which housing density increases without other kinds of uses may defeat one of its own purposes by increasing car use or keeping people at home when the increased density might suggest a more active life on the street. We should think not only about making ADUs easier to build in Eugene, but also ACUs, accessory commercial units, which are becoming part of the discourse of 15-minute neighborhoods. When I first moved to Eugene in the 1980s, there were small grocery stores attached to corner houses in many places throughout the older parts of the city. There are many fewer of those today, but they're arguably more needed and perhaps more viable in neighborhoods of higher density, where they could add to active neighborhood life while also decreasing automobile use. When I was teaching in Portland several years ago, a couple of my students did a survey of houses that had had shops added to their fronts. Many of these additions happened in the 1920s on larger streets that had streetcars and are still in use today, many of them with businesses run by people who live in the connected houses. Over Labor Day weekend, a couple of weeks ago, I was in Portland, and while the downtown still has a way to go in regaining its life post-pandemic, the neighborhoods were alive and active, with people on the street enjoying restaurants and cafes, and they suggested that the mixture of dwelling and work is something to be encouraged and not made difficult. Our zoning code already includes a provision that permits home occupations in dwellings under certain very limited conditions. And in one of Eugene's neighborhoods, the Whitaker, a zoning overlay allows for a wide variety of uses and activities. So there are already a couple of important starts. I would very much like to see a conversation within the city that might be understood as the local version of the national and international conversation that's happening about the nature and location of work, and that dovetails with the important local questions of zoning changes in residential districts. That conversation might begin with a series of questions. Are we in the best situation to be able to innovate in our contribution to that conversation? Do we know whether the laws that are already on the books are allowing for the variety that should be present? Can the home occupation provision in Chapter 9, our zoning ordinance, be modified to make the business more visible and therefore more of a part of neighborhood life? Are there people and families that would benefit from a rethinking of those laws? For example, those who would like to start businesses at home, but who can't for reasons that can be corrected. Or those who operate businesses under the legal radar and who should be allowed to do so legally. Are there neighborhoods that are particularly appropriate for relevant zoning changes and others less so? How can this happen in ways in which problems that many people can foresee, problems of noise, of traffic, of parking, might be mitigated? Can we learn from the way that other cities connect parking requirements to the proximity to public transportation? Might different neighborhoods have different needs, different opportunities that would result in different homegrown tweaks or overlay zones? So I'm not yet advocating a change to the ordinance to allow for more home-based work, but a recognition of it as a potential issue and a close look at how that issue might be dealt with here in Eugene. For about 100 years or so, a particular social ideal about the location of work in relation to home has guided policy, zoning, development, and consequently the form of our cities. That ideal is now being questioned, and it seems important to ask those questions in knowledgeable ways and to ask them in places like this city where the answers might actually result in meaningful change. Thanks very much. Now I think we're going to have some questions.
Thank you to our two speakers today, Frances Hollis from London Metropolitan University and Howard Davis from the University of Oregon. You've opened up a whole, literally a world of questions for us to be asking in our moderated Q&A today. And the first question follows directly on one of the last points that you all raised. And it has to do with our current structure and sort of what we consider to be work and the invisibility of other work. I'm wondering if the two of you could speak a little bit about the long, invisible, home-based work offered by many parents, often women caregivers in our society, and how some of what you're speaking of today addresses a change in perceptions of what work looks like in our society and whose work is considered valuable and contributing and whose work is just presumed to be a part of responsibility and how society functions.
Interesting. Shall I go first?
Yes.
Okay. In my research, you may be disappointed by this answer. I make a really clear distinction between what I think of as productive work and reproductive work. And I think the pandemic has raised all sorts of issues about women's work in the home, the domestic work, the caregiving work, and their productive work. And so I think we've seen women really struggling, primarily women, well, parents, all parents, but primarily women have taken the brunt, I think. And so in some ways, the pandemic has made what women normally do in juggling these aspects of their lives visible. And I think that's been very helpful. And also some men, there's that delightful video that we've seen of, I can't remember who it was, but some man speaking very formally, and then this child comes running in behind him. So I think that's all very, very positive, actually. And I think it starts to put domesticity and childcare onto the map in parallel and in conjunction with our paid work. Howard, what would you add to that?
I have nothing to add. I mean, I think you've done it. I mean, I would say very, very similar things. So.
Thank you both. Our next question is from City Club Program Committee Member Juan Carlos Moreira.
Thank you so much, Karim. Thank you so much, Professor Hollis, Professor Davis. Very, very interesting insights. But when I was listening to both of you, I keep on thinking about my past before coming to the States 27 years ago. So I come from the global South, and I have been in the global North or the global West, whatever, depending the perspective, for, as I said, for 27 years. But can we, in your research or your studies or your thinking, have you thought about using examples from the global South, from impoverished and developing countries, in which these uses of housing density and the house as a place for work, for innovation, for entrepreneurship, or even for survival have taken place for a long, long time. So I would like to hear your insights or your thoughts in terms of that proposition that definitely we can learn from Europe, or we can learn from the experience here in the States and in different states within this large country. But what about those societies in which this has been done before and not necessarily because of the pandemic?
Can I start with that one? Because I think that's very, very good point. And I've made that point in one of my previous books. I've spent a lot of time in India looking exactly at this kind of thing in the so-called slums of India, where the house is ipso facto a place for work and a place for dwelling. So much so that you really can't separate work from dwelling. There is a scholar named Peter Kellett who teaches at Newcastle, who's made his whole career at looking at the combined use of the house and the house in slums, essentially, for productive work as well as dwelling. So I think those examples are really very important, and they've been actually very important to me in thinking about this whole question, because obviously the amount of space is limited. A house is automatically something that has to be very flexible in terms of its function, going back and forth between dwelling and work and so forth. So yes, I think it's important to do that, to look at those situations with respect for the lives of people who are actually living in those places. And it's all over the world. I've seen it in India, I've seen it in South America, I've seen it in Southeast Asia and so forth. So very, very good and important question, because I think those lessons are, I think we need to connect with those situations.
I would completely agree with what Howard says. And I would go further to say that I think there's a potential sort of heartbreak going on, because these situations often aren't properly valued in their own cultures, and that people are still looking to the global north, to the separation that has happened between work and home. And I think it should be completely the other way, that we should recognize the mistakes that we've learned by separating the two things out so much, and totally turn to the global south. I mean, you know, Kellett's work in places like Dharavi in India, absolutely fascinating, and the efficiency, the fluidity, and the sense of community that builds just by people living and working in such close proximity is really important and interesting.
Our next question is from City Club Board Member Andrew Kolak.
Thanks very much. I'm coming to you from my home office, which is appropriate for this conversation. And one of the reasons why we love being here in Eugene, of course, is access to the outdoors and space, things that you might not be able to get in a big city. And yet, as somebody who used to live in New York City, I'm very aware of how important density is for many of the things that make city life possible, and indeed are good for the climate writ large, specifically the subway. So for instance, I'm looking at the numbers from yesterday. About 2.7 million people were on the subway yesterday in New York. That's down 52% from pre-pandemic, same day. So my question is, how do we maintain the structures of the city that make it great, both from a cultural and climate perspective, while also enabling people to effectively work from anywhere if they are able to, including from their homes? Thanks very much.
You want to start with that, Francis? Or
Yep, I'll run with that one. I don't think I see what the problem is. I think that people have very rigid ideas about what home-based work is, and they imagine houses with home offices in them. But actually, they can take a very radical range wide range of different sorts of forms. And certainly in London, where I am today, where I live, we've got a really interesting situation going on with the central business district there, because it is half empty. And so there's a sort of really fascinating thing of what's going to happen. And for sure, it's not going to stay half empty. And political will, policy is going to make a big difference as to what does happen. But if you ask me what should happen, then I think that these surplus office buildings can be transformed to be places where people live and work. So you can design non-standard housing for people who have non-standard spatial or environmental needs. So potentially, I think you could have really interesting quarters, particularly for creative industries, taking over where we have had sort of blanket office buildings. So I think that accepting that buildings shouldn't sit empty and they shouldn't be knocked down, obviously with a climate emergency, then the how cities develop policies to enable people to actually move in to inhabit those buildings that are empty because people aren't now commuting in is going to be one of the really interesting things that is debated hotly over the coming years, I think. What would you say, Howard?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, before the pandemic, one of the things that was happening in cities like London, New York, San Francisco, is that the people who arguably can benefit from cities the most, I don't know, the people like artists, the creative class and so forth, were moving out. They were actually going to out of the city because they couldn't afford to live there anymore, right? My prediction is, and then again, who I don't know that this is going to happen, but my prediction is that if in fact big businesses start to themselves allow for people to work at home, shrink their footprint in buildings, right, and make buildings available again for housing or for all of these other people, right, who want to be in city but couldn't and had to move out. That's going to change our cities in ways where it's really the people who want to be there and who need to be there, the creative class, small manufacturing, artists and so forth, will actually start to reoccupy those buildings in ways that Francis is talking about, start to reoccupy those buildings which had been filled with just office workers and a zillion people sitting in front of computers. So I think that the transformation may very well be quite a healthy one, even if there starts to be a decline in the total population of cities. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but I think there are forces that may actually result in the kind of combining of the real advantages of cities and the possibility that cities are not going to be sprawling all over the landscape anymore.
Howard,
One thing I might add to that, shall I just add, there's one thing I'd like to add to that, which is that what we're seeing in the UK is that city centre properties are lowering in value, and properties outside the big cities are increasing in value. And I think that's a really interesting phenomenon, because it means that, as Howard says, people who previously couldn't inhabit the centre of the city may be able to in the future because it'll be cheaper. And outside the city, where it was less densely populated, is becoming more popular, and so people are moving. So there's a sort of huge shift. I mean, who knows where it's going to go? It's fascinating to watch, but I don't fear for our cities. I think our cities will be fine.
Well, Francis, what you just offered also relates maybe to this next follow-up question, which has to do with something that one of the conditions that Jane Jacobs wrote about in one of her brilliant writings about thriving and living cities, which is the existence of inexpensive space for interesting things to occur within. And that is really the basis of this next question, that as space becomes less expensive in our cities, does this mean we're actually going back to an opportunity that many people thought had long passed, which is that it could be less expensive to once more occupy a space near the center?
Well, I sure
think
hope
that's
what-
likely. Oh, sorry, Howard. You
no,
go.
I would say I sure hope that that's what's happening, and the trend in commercial rents in downtowns certainly is pointing in that direction. Now, whether that's gonna continue once the pandemic is over, if the pandemic is over, whether that's going to continue or not, I don't know. But that certainly does seem to be the trend, and the kind of leveling out that Francis described, I think is a pretty healthy phenomenon potentially.
I think one thing that will act as a determinant is political policy. And I certainly in the UK, our current government is not overly encouraging people to continue to work from home, because in some ways they want to maintain the property values in these central business districts. And so we'll see what happens. But at the moment, in the UK we have a shortage of employees, and so the employees are calling the shots, and flexible working is one of the shots that they're calling, one of the things that they're after. So we'll see.
Well, that's true here as well to some extent. Yep. I mean, we have apparently a big labor shortage at the moment. What it's gonna look like in 6 months, we don't know, but it's a similar situation here.
That is also a perfect transition into another question from a City Club member, which is related to this issue of utilization of commercial properties, but as it relates to the collection of property tax. What does it mean in a city or a place like Eugene that collects a significant amount of its public funding solely from property taxes, when large areas that generate the greatest amount of our public property tax income decrease in value? What does that mean for decision makers, and how should the community be preparing to adjust?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not as familiar with the tax structure here as would allow me to answer that question. So I don't know. And I'd like to see the numbers. In other words, I'd like to see one of the things I think we should do is look, for example, at that question, making, a few possible projections, because it's clear that if we knew that, it might affect policy, but what it will actually mean, I just don't know.
I think this is a really, really interesting and terrifying question, and it has already crossed my thoughts that actually we need everyone to be working in the offices in order to raise the taxes, in order to fund the city. And what I'd like to throw into the pot is the Japanese system. So in the UK, we have a completely bonkers property taxation system that it's binary, and we have a different tax if a property is residential and if a property is commercial. And this causes all sorts of real complications when you have buildings that combine dwelling and workplace. But in Japan, they have a single property tax, and it's moderated depending on it is partly moderated in use. So it's reduced for small scale residential, and it's increased for large scale commercial. But primarily the property taxation is set according to the location, according to the services, the facilities that are available. So somewhere central that's very highly serviced is more expensive than somewhere that's distant. So what I would be suggesting is that this is a moment, I mean, it's what I said, this is a paradigm shift. This is not about tweaking the edges. This is about fundamental change. And so I think that property taxation systems probably need a very thorough overhaul in the face of the new circumstances.
Thank you. This next question is shifting gears a little bit and returns to the experience of the worker. There's been a lot of commentary around work in this past year, and many times the issues of loneliness or isolation have been raised. How much do you think that experience of loneliness or isolation is a result of a pandemic condition? And do you think it is about the location of the work being at home, or the fact that that home is located so distant to other things?
I think it's
great question.
I think it's a really good question. I think that, see, I'm interested not only in people working at home, but also in the nature of the neighborhood in which that home is located, right? Because clearly, if someone is working at home and that's it, and there's nothing outside, there's nothing within a 3-minute walk or 5-minute walk that will put this person in touch with other people, then loneliness is going to be a problem. But if you're in a neighborhood, right, where you are working at home, but next door there's someone else working at home, and outside there's a place where you can go and get coffee or buy your groceries or whatever, then what you've got is a neighborhood which supports people being together, and not only the individual house, which by itself supports people being apart.
I'd agree with that, but I think it is important to separate out the pandemic from the whole issue of working from home, because there's no doubt that the pandemic has made social isolation much worse. But this is one of the really big drawbacks of working from home. But if you go back, if you look at previous eras, people worked from home without being socially isolated. And so it's very much to do with absolutely what Howard says about the nature of the neighborhood and the sort of this fine-grained mixed use, so you can walk up the road to the bakery. You don't have to get in your car and drive for a quarter of an hour. But also the whole idea of the buildings that people live and work in not being designed to the model that our homes have been designed for a long time, which is as private, inward-looking spaces, that actually there is some sense of them being outward-looking and connected, communicating from the inside to the outside with people who walk by, or or in neighboring buildings or whatever, so that you get that sense of connection and that sense of a knowledge of what people are up to. Because I agree, I think if you just go in your front door and then you're simply not seen again, people have no idea what you're doing, and that raises not just issues of social isolation, but of real problems that people develop with their occupational identity as well.
One of the things about the ordinance that allows for home occupations, in other words, our zoning ordinance, is that it's what Francis is saying is absolutely right. And here it's locked into law that the only thing that can appear on a house is a single sign that might advertise the business that's going on inside, but you can't see that business. In other words, it actually can't be visible from the street, because then it would be, I don't know, it would take away from the essential residential character of that house, right? But what Francis is saying is that if that connection was physical and people could see, and you sort of knew what was going on inside the house, you're inside the house, you can see out to the street, that somehow automatically changes the sense of isolation.
We have time for maybe just a few more questions today. So first, a follow-up from Andrew Pollack.
Thanks very much. A recent report from LinkedIn had Eugene and Bend actually in the top 5 nationwide in terms of the percentage of people applying for remote work. And it spoke to how remote work can be a real economic opportunity for Oregon, particularly outside of the Valley, in places that may have struggled economically in the past. And so I'm curious if both of you think that there's a role for government or the private sector to play in actually pushing for people to be able to work from home in places that have struggled economically, and whether that is a good idea as we're rethinking the nature of work in general.
Well, there have been, I mean, this is already happening. In other words, there have been initiatives in rural towns and cities in this country to actually support home-based work. In other words, people who are working just by telephone or computer or whatever. So those initiatives already do exist, and I think it's perfectly reasonable that they would, you know. So yes.
I think there's a lot of scope for policy at the governmental level, at the local level, at the organizational level, because I think that once policy starts to really support and encourage this working practice, then all sorts of changes can actually be encouraged, be developed. So I don't know about actually pushing home-based work in particular locations, but certainly making it very desirable. I mean, an obvious thing is if property prices are low. You know, if you've got an area that's been struggling and property prices are low, then people are going to want to go there because they get more space for their money. And so I think maybe these things might sort themselves out fairly sort of automatically, but I don't know. And I think there probably is an enormous amount of scope for creative, imaginative policy making. And I hope that local authorities and government officials will start to tackle this. I mean, at the moment, certainly it's not happening in the UK. I mean, we've got our Labour Party, which is in opposition, has adopted the policy that it should that there should be a right, that everyone should have a right to flexible working where it's feasible to work from home. But nobody's gone any further than that, I don't think. But let's watch and see. I think it's a very interesting area.
I don't think that particular places should be given preference. I think that all places should have in all places, or most places, people should have the right to work at home, and that it should be encouraged. I don't think it's up to the government or private enterprise to make these decisions, but I think people should have freedom, right? If they want to work at home, they should be able to.
Yes, but Howard, you could imagine if certain areas of the city or certain small towns actually, you could imagine there being policies that said, we will really favour people who want to come here and set up their businesses or do this sort of work or whatever. You can imagine that as a policy angle.
Yeah, I could, but I wouldn't do it in a way that would, let's say, exclude a business who wanted to establish themselves in that place, and you know, where people didn't work at home.
Oh no.
You know, I just think that choice is the most important thing.
Juan Carlos, you had a follow-up question as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Karim. In addition to dwellings and housing density and the dynamic of neighborhoods and policies, what about the need for more multi-sector partnerships, more multi-sector cooperation, especially in terms of Now we probably are using different, our utilities, water supplies, sewer systems, internet connections, even transportation, because of the way we are using our houses for work. And I heard from some people that I know that they have had some challenges with those key components of an effective workplace.
Well, I think that, as we, it is like a number of us, certainly myself and Howard, I know, are, doing this call from home, and the internet is a challenge. There's no doubt about it. It's like, if it drops out, we drop out. And so I think there's something quite interesting about that happens when our work relies on services, and in some ways we maybe have lower standards for our domestic buildings than for our commercial buildings, and that maybe this needs to really even out, and that, again, the fast internet needs to become a sort of an essential service for all people. Certainly in the UK, it's very variable where you have it fast and strong and where you don't. And so, as for water and electricity, I'm not so sure that they're quite so important, but the internet certainly.
Well, the new infrastructure bill, hope it passes, is dealing with that. So I think there's a recognition, even at the federal government level, that this is pretty important.
Thank you both. We are out of time, and unfortunately, another City Club of Eugene has come to an end. But thank you so much to Frances Hollis, coming to us live from London Metropolitan University, City Club's first ever international guest speaking with us today, and Howard Davis from here in Eugene and the University of Oregon. Thank you for helping us to think about the future of work, what it means for our workers, everyone in our communities, and the structure of the environment around us. We will see you all next week on the City Club of Eugene.
Thanks very much. That was fun.
Thank you. Thank you for including me.
This concludes our September 17, 2021 program. Thanks to our diamond sponsors. Kaiser Permanente exists to provide high quality, affordable healthcare services and to improve the health of our members and the communities we serve. More information at www.kp.org. Support comes from the University of Oregon. Since 1876, U of O has helped Oregonians question critically, think logically, reason effectively, communicate clearly, act creatively, and live ethically. More information at uoregon.edu. Peace Health is proud to serve Eugene, Lane County, and beyond. As your hometown healthcare partner for more than 80 years, our mission is to keep you and your family healthy. Learn more at peacehealth.org. Lane Community College transforms lives through learning. LCC provides comprehensive, accessible, high-quality educational opportunities that promote student success. For more information, visit lanecc.edu. I'd also like to acknowledge our gold sponsors, Dr. Sanya Barra, Hearing Associates, Hirschner Hunter Attorneys, Pacific Cascade Credit Union, and thank you to our in-kind sponsors, KRVM 91.9 Radio, PAC Info and Simplified Computing LLC, Dotson's Photography. And a special thank you to public radio station KLCC FM 89.7 for airing City Club programs on Mondays at 7 p.m. Our programs are on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page. All City Club members can ask a question at a taping of our programs. You can join and then participate. More information is on our website, cityclubofeugene.org. In our next program, we'll also get a preview of what's coming next and how the discoveries and inventions emerging from the Knight campus can have an impact right here at home. The Knight campus, how the growth of a research juggernaut can change the world and Eugene. So please join us again on September 24. Now I would like to thank today's speakers for a great program. So thank you, Francis Hollis and Howard Davis. This concludes today's program. Hope to see you next Friday.